in order to really talk about like what this means in terms of like your business structure, we're going to talk, I'm going to talk with my friend, John Morkes. He's here. Hey, John.
Hey everybody, how are you doing, Andy?
Awesome. I'm glad you're here. John is one of our partners. John, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure, so I'm happy to be part of Driven this year. I've been doing UX for about 20 years or so. Started out as a UX researcher, but then got into managing UX design teams as well. I've known folks from BP3 for about 20 years from other companies where we've worked. And I've been lucky enough to work with Andy on some projects. Andy, I will never match your energy level. There's just no way in this talk, probably or ever. So just be prepared for that. But I'll try to be smart at least.
No doubt. I know you will. Which is why you're here. We love working with John. And so this was something that you and I discussed is really how do we know where people are in terms of their maturity and where they, and how can we get them to where they want to be? So why don't you take us through this and we'll kind of talk about it as we go.
Sure. So it's really important for companies to understand where they are in terms of UX maturity because you want to know what you're doing right and what you could do better, right? To get the most value out of your user experience resources and activities. You want to get the most business value. You don't want to be leaving money on the table. So really, a lot of this is about making money and saving money, and UX can do a lot to help you do those things. So at the bottom of this ladder here, we have unaware, and these are companies that generally don't know much about UX or really aren't focused on it, going all the way up to strategic. And so we're going to go through briefly each one of these.
Yeah, let's jump into it. So tell me about companies that are unaware.
Yeah, so for the unaware phase, and maybe some of us have worked in those companies, I know I have. At first, a lot of startups start out this way, where they might have a great algorithm or some great functionality that nobody else has. And so they're really focused on just building out that technology, getting it out into the marketplace, and they're not so focused on providing a great user experience if there is a front end to it. And so that means that they don't have business goals defined that relate to UX, or they're not recognizing that UX is important. They're not really focused on what users might need or want. The approach really is, we're going to build this and we're going to tell people how to, just to use it, and they'll figure out how to use it because it's so great. The UI development is usually an afterthought. So it's not like they have somebody assigned in the beginning who's going to really focus on UX throughout the process. It's more like, okay, now we have to put a UI on this, and it's usually done at the end, and who's available to do it. And it might not be anybody with UX or UI development skills. And the assumption then is that that person is going to design the UI in ways that make sense to that person, right? So the developer who implements it gets to decide what the user experience is going to be, and that developer builds it basically for himself or herself. And that's not great.
And we also, that's like the one size fits all, huh?
Yeah, we also have this problem where there's only one user basically that it's designed for, right? It's not for different roles. It's not taking into account different wants and needs from different types of users.
So like from an enterprise UX perspective, what kind of impact do you think that has on internally, like operationally, the business itself?
So it really depends on the kind of solution this is or system this is. Mm-hmm. But many times, if there's a front end to it, there are some UI components and UX components that are important, right? And if you don't meet those basic needs that users have and those expectations that have been set now by use of smartphones and tablets and all that for many years, you're really potentially losing out on adoption. You're losing out on usability, which means that people aren't going to get their tasks done efficiently. They're less likely to recommend this to other people, right? So they're not going to get their tasks done, as you mentioned, as one of the goals for UX.
Okay. So let's talk more about, let's go to the next level, aware.
Yeah, and so some of those problems emerge, right? So it's out there getting used or not used by people. The company that built it says, oh, what's going on? Our adoption is low. Right. People are calling support. They have a lot of questions on how to do things. And why isn't it obvious, right? And
Right.
so customers complain, and then that's when leadership says, okay, we really need to do something. We're losing money here. We're not going to get the renewals. We're not going to get the licenses or sales. And so at this point, people start collecting usability issues that they're aware of. And they're also hearing things like, well, we have different roles that you're not addressing, right? It's a one-size-fits-all situation. We have approvers for certain tasks, right? People who need to submit things to be approved, and you're not representing that, for example. And so this lack of UX focus becomes really obvious to people. And at this point, people are trying to figure out what to do next.
And is there a higher dependency on training in companies like this?
Yeah, so a lot of times in the kind of unaware stage, companies aren't even really thinking about how to roll this out, right?
Right.
So there isn't real good training available. There isn't a plan to do beta testing and collect UX feedback from those users
Right.
along the way, and then adjust, fix things before it's fully deployed. So that is a big problem, and that can hurt adoption, that can leave money on the table and all that as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about engage. What makes a company engage with UX?
So once companies are aware and they know they have a problem, it's like okay, we need to throw some UX love at this, or they might call it UI love still, right?
Okay.
So we need somebody to come in, and they might go out and hire somebody to work on fixing these usability problems, to throw some UX or UI magic at this. And one thing to be careful of in this point is, if you're doing enterprise UX, you're probably working on a complicated system, maybe with lots of data, complicated processes and tasks for the users, probably different user roles. You want to make sure that you get the right person or people involved to do the UX with you, and that you don't just go out and grab a web designer, a random web designer, somebody who's done like simple websites, or a graphic designer who makes things look pretty, right? You don't want to go off and grab that wrong person and then expect that person to understand even the problems that you're trying to solve. So be careful about that.
Certainly been the case in projects that you and I have worked on, where they're really just complex, data-heavy enterprise solutions.
Right. And we've often come in and we've tried to fix things that other people have tried to do initially.
Right.
And it turned out that they didn't have the right background or even interest sometimes in tackling those kinds of problems. So also in this phase where people are engaged now and trying to solve their UX problem, they start to do a little bit of research where they look internally, right? So they might create some wireframes, some early design prototypes, and they might realize, okay, well, let's get some feedback. But the issue is that they go internal. So they'll go to subject matter experts, or they'll go to managers who used to be in that user role many years ago, and they'll say, what do you think about this? Or what do you think the requirements are? And this is better than nothing, right? But be careful with that, because you're leaving a lot of important data to the side, and that is data from target users, from actual users that you care about. And then also at this stage, people recognize, okay, well, we do have multiple user types and they're different. And so they don't really understand at this stage what those differences are, but at least they recognize that they're going to have different users.
And going back to the SMEs and managers, I think one thing I remember you said to me, which really made me laugh and stuck with me, is, yeah, that person might have done that job, but they haven't done it since the Clinton administration,
right.
Which really gives you perspective about how long ago that might have been and how much things might have changed, not only with the job, but also their personal goals and priorities.
Right. I mean, there could be even a generational difference, right, in people's expectations. People who grew up with, all the technology that young people have today versus people like me who, learned how to type in high school on a typewriter, right? Very different.
Right.
So,
yeah.
At this stage, also, we see some collaboration between the designer and developers. So designers probably creating mock-ups or prototypes and then showing them to developers or handing them off to developers for implementation. So it's still kind of early stage compared to the process that you were talking about. And this whole thing, by the way, is hard to do, right? As Scott mentioned in the beginning, this is not easy to just go and do a great UX from the start. It takes time, experience, trial and error, all that kind of stuff. And then also in this stage, they're really not focused too much on measuring the outcomes. They're not measuring things like usability or user adoption in the right way. They're not looking at opportunities to find where UX can add value and then measure to make sure that you're on track to get there before you actually deploy it.
Okay, so this is kind of like the this is the it's better than nothing phase.
It's better than nothing.
All right, so integrated. That sounds nice.
Yeah, so things are getting better all the time here, right? So at this point, that in the last stage, that one UX person resulted in some improvements, right? So fewer complaints and better usability, and it probably looks better and all that, and that's great. And so the company says, okay, let's get some more UX people on projects, and that's a very good thing, right? And then there's a little bit more process, something that looks closer to what you described, Andy, where there's iteration, right, between UX and development people. At this stage also, typically they recognize, okay, front-end development is a skill in itself, right? If you want somebody to know, like if you're going to use Angular material, you need somebody who knows what that is and can learn it, right? And you can't just throw any old full-stack developer or back-end developer especially at this problem and have them figure it out at the very end. So this is starting to be valued now as a skill that the team needs. Product management and UX design should be working really closely. They should be best friends. And at this stage, they're starting to work more closely, and they're doing stuff that's informed by data from UX research, which includes user studies, right? So we're getting information about requirements and feedback from target users that we care about. So people who match the personas that we're starting to identify.
So in your experience, do companies at this stage usually have any kind of structured product management?
Some do and some don't. So sometimes it's just a subject matter expert who might be put in that role of product manager, and that person's responsible for requirements and making decisions about what's in and what's out and how things should work. But the more enlightened companies realize that you can't just take a subject matter expert and have them read some blogs or a book or whatever and make them a product manager. That it takes time, it takes training, and a lot of times you might be better off with a product manager who doesn't know your discipline coming in and then learning your discipline, right? Somebody with product management experience.
Right.
Or pairing that person with subject matter experts, and they can all work together and figure it out. So another thing that happens at this stage is that some of the goals that you were talking about, Andy, they finally have UX metrics attached to them. So you mentioned something about value of functionality and data and content. I think that those were the words that you used. We can actually measure that, and along the way of creating prototypes, and before it's fully deployed, we can measure how valuable people think certain functionality is, right, by asking them. And then once it's out there, it's not a surprise. You can predict really well how it will be received by measuring this early on and then along the way during the design and development stages.
That's great. Okay, so then leveling up, like this I would think is really where people want to be right here.
Yeah, I mean, these, the last two, this one and the next one, this is where you want to be. So for this one, we have UX metrics really guiding teams' work, right? So if your user adoption is important for us to make money, keep our customers happy, then we have user metrics around, UX metrics around that will help us know ahead of time whether we're on track. We also have UX people deployed appropriately on the different teams. It doesn't mean that every team has a whole bunch of UX people. It just means that when UX is needed, when you need to address it, there are people with the right skills who are available to work on it. And they're working on multidisciplinary teams with product managers and front-end developers and back-end developers, and all the skills that you need are there. We also, at this point, have a UX design that serves as the spec for implementation. So it's not an optional suggestion kind of thing.
Okay.
It's a situation where you have good UX people who know what they're doing and they're doing a good process, along with other people on the team. And everyone recognizes that the design that is quote unquote final for a particular release is the spec, and that's what gets implemented. And there needs to be a good reason for deviating from that design if you're a developer. So,
right. So it sounds like there's a lot more trust in the product that UX is delivering and the work that they're doing.
There's a lot more trust, and there was good collaboration as well throughout the process. So it's not a surprise when that final spec is delivered. If you had issues or questions earlier, it's all been worked out with the team. Also, UX research is happening. So like I said, you could do research to find out what functionality, for example, is valuable, right? You can just ask, how valuable is this tab design approach to you from 0 to 10, right? Versus another approach. And users will tell you, and then you can find an average score and figure out if it's 9 out of 10 from everybody, then great. That's probably a good design solution, right? And then later in the process, we have other techniques that we can bring to bear to test usability. We could do surveys that are qualitative to help you understand why something's important or why something should work a certain way. And then
I'm hearing a lot of data. There's a lot of data supporting the design.
Right. It's not just one thing. It's not just like a feedback form in your screen, right, where people can just type, you know, I don't like it, or it's not like a survey with one question, right? And then at this point, also, a lot of times companies will have a design system in place or a pattern library. They'll have design style guides, and the best companies will pair it with a component library that developers created, so that it's really easy for design and prototyping to just pull from this library. You get consistent designs. It's good for user expectations. They're familiar with it. It's presented consistently. And we have code that works, hopefully. And it can be, the best ones are kind of production ready code or almost ready code.
Right, things that are highly reusable and allow our process to be even more agile.
Right, so think like tables, right? How are we gonna do tables? How are we gonna do buttons? And some other things like that.
Right, and reusing those over and over again. That's awesome. And so really, so then this is like the creme de la creme of like UX maturity. And why is that? Why is this where people really want to get to?
I mean, this is hard to get to, but some companies do make it. I've worked with companies that are here, right? And at this stage, the strategic stage, you're getting the full value out of your UX team, right? And you're maximizing the user experience for your users so that they're able to do their tasks. It's easy and efficient for them. They like it. They like it to the point that they will be your big fans and they will be recommending you to other companies. And there's a whole understanding of the importance of user experience throughout the organization. So, you know, whether you're a developer or a doc writer or product manager or even anybody in the company, marketing, everybody understands why it's important. And these are the companies where somebody proposes an idea and somebody else will say, well, what will our users think about that idea? Let's go find out. Or do we know already? Right. And this is if you're a UX person, this is like the great place to be, because you can actually hold up a release if there's an issue that is going to prevent you from meeting your goals. Right?
Wouldn't that be
So wouldn't that be great? And this happens where you can say, okay, if we implement it that way that you're proposing, our adoption will suffer, or it'll be impossible for them to complete this critical task, right? And then in this strategic phase also, everything is staffed appropriately. So if you need an interaction designer or a visual designer, etc., you have access to all those folks. And they're embedded in the teams.
Or you're having the right people.
Yeah, and then also UX has a seat at the table in terms of defining the goals for the company. So if you're a company that has a front end and it's important, then UX is there and they're helping figure out, okay, you want to have a world-class user experience. And this is something, Andy, that a client of ours said to us not that long ago. And we're like, that sounds great, right? What does that mean? And we'll help you define what that means and then how we can measure it so you can see whether we're on track. And then outcomes are continuously measured against the goals.
So I think what I hear here, I mean, in the last section, we talked a lot about data being informed. And I think when I hear this, when I think about strategic companies, I think there's more questions than there are answers. People are always willing to embrace the questions and the ambiguity, and
Right.
and there's a willingness and process usually to navigate that ambiguity to get the information required with an
Yep.
understanding that that information can also change.
And working through that is just normal. It's just part of the process. And you end up where you need to be, right? So doing all of this means that you're reducing the risk of building the wrong thing. You're saving money. You're not going out and building the wrong thing. And then you have this terrible question of, are we going to live with this? Are we going to redo this?
Right.
Or are we going to go back to the legacy thing that we've been using and just be stuck, right? So this process and this focus on UX will help you avoid that problem.
So guys, we have
Awesome.
some really good questions that have come into the chat. So
Okay, before we answer them, do you want to start a poll and then we can answer them while people answer the poll?
that sounds good. We'll go ahead and launch this poll. And so the first question is, how do I sell the idea that design is important to my company?
All right. Oh God. Okay. Well, I mean, in my experience, I think it's about just showing people the value over time. It's trying to adopt little practices here and there, and kind of holding firm and having a design process that you trust, and trying to kind of bring people in there whenever you can, and then showing them the value by saying, you know, it's a lot of perseverance. I don't know, John, what would you say about that?
I think that's great, but I would also, at the same time, I would point to the pain, right? So there's value, and then the flip side is, what are we losing right now? Is it, you know, people don't want to use our app, people don't want to recommend us for sales because our app is terrible, or, you know, what is the issue that UX is going to solve, UX team is going to solve for this company, and
Right.
point that out, and then show the value by saying, okay, if we do these things based on other projects we've done, or, you know, things that I'm aware of, I think that we're going to be able to increase adoption by 5%, 10%. And what does that look like? How many dollars does that amount to? Or we're going to save on support costs, right? If we fix this one big problem, we're going to get fewer support calls. And what does each call cost us, right? Try to attach dollars to it, and then slowly, like step by step, baby steps, we always say, try to show the value, show, you know, improvement, and then you'll get buy-in. I mean, I've worked on projects where it's like a switch, right? All of a sudden, people love UX and they all want it, and you're like, oh, we don't have enough people, right?
Right. And I think we worked on a project like that where there was a lot of, you know, blocking access to users, and just, you know, I think I remember in the last project we worked on, you know, the project lead basically just said, well, it's just a database and some maintenance screens, right? What's the problem? Yeah. And then, you know, without that access to users, you know, but then once we finally got the access to users, it's like the light bulb came on, right? And then everyone was like, oh, we want to do this more. We want to get this data more.
Right. You take that user input and stakeholder input, put it together, and you make good decisions about what to do. You can't have just one side or the other side. You really need both.
Were there more questions?
Yes, there are more questions, so we need to move a little bit faster through them, but we'll go ahead and share the poll results. So it looks like most of the people, 44%, said that they are in that middle stage of engaged.
Yeah, right.
One of the questions that relates to this is, how big are these organizations at each of these stages? And I guess specifically, are you looking at, when you get up to strategic, you have to be a Fortune 100 company, or Can small companies be strategic with their design? And then how big are those UX teams that you said are fully staffed, which if I ever work in a company where any department is fully staffed is going to be just amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a lot of, those are a lot of good companies. So,
Yeah. Yeah,
so
go for it.
engaged here, 44%, that makes sense to me. I mean, I would have guessed that. Most companies would be in the middle. I have worked with small companies and large companies that are unaware, and I've worked with small and large companies that are strategic. So I don't know that company size matters so much. It's probably easier to be strategic if you're actually a small company because your focus is more limited. There are fewer people that you need to educate and bring on board. But as you grow, good luck keeping that strategic focus, right? Andy, what were you going to say?
I think I was going to say the same thing. I mean, being strategic, basically, the point there is that, and we're going to talk about what that looks like in this next section here, and kind of what the ingredients of that are. But that basically just means you're being really focused and goal-oriented. And so the size doesn't matter there. The UX team size could, I would say, is more dependent on the complexity of the problems you're solving, one, and the size of the kind of number of streams or problems you're trying to solve at once. I mean, that's why, companies like, Google and Apple have huge UX teams, whereas, smaller product companies don't necessarily need that, because, they can have a UX designer that is also good enough at research. But once that product, kind of reaches a new level and you're reaching more users, there's only so many things that one person can design and test at one time. And if your development team grows, and I think I've heard the rule of thumb is you should have one designer for every 4 developers. And that's kind of just more of a throughput problem, is how much design work can be created that 4 developers can work on. Otherwise, you're going to have a throughput issue.
I used to answer that question with a number, and I don't anymore because it depends on so many variables. Like, we'd be happy to talk to people offline afterwards and try to give you some more guidance on that one, but that's a very tricky one.
Well, we'll probably put that one over in the Driven Slack organization so that everybody can kind of chime in. And don't forget the Driven Slack organization, a link is at the top of the chat. So we'll just do one more question because we have more questions coming in at a very rapid pace. So how do you get cultural support of UX? Do you recommend building a UX COE? We have a comment from one of my favorite attendees. She's been here all 5 days. I see recently many companies started their own separate enterprise level UX teams for specific enterprise level standard designs. So is that something that you guys would recommend, starting these COEs or these enterprise teams?
I mean, I think, I've seen a lot of, there's a lot of ways to structure design teams. And design is still a relatively newly, in relation to how old the UX discipline is, it's still evolving as in terms of, operations. How should UX fit into operations? I think the best thing I've seen is like a mixed strategy between some kind of centralized UX operation and a UX operation where you have UX people kind of placed in teams. And I think the reason that is because, to me, and I think you can tell from that section before, is UX and product thinking and design thinking. It's all really a UX designer is someone who's not just like trying to figure out how the thing should work. It's really, you want UX kind of imbued into everyone's thinking, but the UX designer specifically is focused on solving solution-oriented problems. But not every company has that. So it's hard to do. The cultural change is probably the hardest. And I think that's because it's not tech culture, it's work culture. Work culture is very broken. And there's ways of mitigating that. And I think UX, in my experience, UX designers, like facilitators, have the best skills in order to mitigate those things because they know how to reduce the conversations and navigate around politics. So the cultural part is really difficult, and I actually even point that out later. But I would say that organizationally, I think that embedding UX designers in multidisciplinary teams is probably the best first step.
And taking baby steps and working on the most valuable, most critical projects to shine a light on what UX is capable of doing, that helps a lot. That helps change the culture. Because if you're in there, if you're one of the people helping the company make money, save money, and people know about it, they're going to want more of what you're doing, right? So that alone will help you out. I don't know whether it needs to be a COE, possibly, if that helps you get to where you need to be, but doing actual work goes a long way.